I listened to your podcast with Kurt Metzger, who I know, and I've been on his podcast, had a great time on his pod.
He's a fun dude.
He is. But I think I disagree with you both kind of on the Israel issue. On the idea, there was one point where you were kind of saying it's almost as if the Jews are doing what was done to them.
Well,
as if it's genocide.
I'm saying that when you're killing 30,000 innocent civilians in response to something that killed 1,200 innocent civilians, and you're continuing to bomb an area into oblivion, which is what it looks like when you're looking at Gaza. There's many people that have made the argument that that is at least the steps of genocide or a form of genocide. You're destroying thousands and thousands of people's homes and killing them.
So when you say 30,000 civilians, it's not 30,000 civilians.
What you're about to listen to here is an interview that Joe Rogan did with Coleman Hughes. Coleman Hughes is a very interesting new intellectual that's come on the map, and he has an interesting take on the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and one that I think it's important to highlight when we work through kind of what is the truth about the Israel and Hamas war, about this conflict and what's going on here, who's in the right, and how we can understand this conflict and what's going on. So let's take a look.
How many thousands have been killed?
So according to Gaza Health Ministry, which it is run by Hamas, the number they have is 32,000, but they don't distinguish between Hamas and civilians.
How many members of Hamas are there?
40,000, something like that. I don't think the number is known, but it's tens of thousands. So Hamas says 32,000 people have been killed, civilians and soldiers. Israel says 13,000 soldiers have been killed by Israel. So if you just let's not doubt either number. They could both be inflated. But if both of those numbers are accurate, which it may or may not be, that would be 13,000 soldiers killed, 19,000 civilians killed, which for urban combat in the Middle East is a very normal ratio.
I see what you're saying. If you wanted to look at it cold and objectively, yeah.
But I hope it doesn't come across cold because.
But it's mostly women and children that are dying. That are dying because they're in a place where these terrorists are. Right. I mean, it's not
because the terrorists on purpose embed themselves with the civilian population, which is a war crime.
Right. Which is a strategy that they have clearly employed when you see them. And when the IDF went into that hospital and found Hamas
just recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's real. It's not just a conspiracy theory. We know that that's real.
All right. First big point I think Coleman Hughes brings up that's really important to highlight. He said the terrorists on purpose embed themselves with the civilian population. That is a key point in this whole argument and this whole idea of understanding what's the real nature, what's the true nature of this conflict between Israel and Hamas. Let's keep going.
But you're still talking about 20,000, whatever it is, of innocent people getting bombed into the Stone Age. And then there's this, what are the pressures that are being put on people that are trying to deliver aid? How difficult is it?
So my understanding of the aid issue, and I've looked into it quite a bit, is that the aid is getting into Gaza. They've gotten over 1/4 ton of food into Gaza since the beginning of the war, which is pretty similar to the food that was getting in. The problem is it's not getting to the people, especially in the north, because the north is a war zone. So it's getting through the border. Israel's allowing it in. But then what happens is the IDF doesn't control the delivery. The delivery is controlled by humanitarian organizations like UNRWA and just a whole bevy of humanitarian organizations. And they have these aid convoys going to people, but then Hamas hijacks it, random gang of people, Palestinians hijack it, hungry civilians hijack it, and it's an absolute mess in terms of distributing the aid. And that's why you see, and it was a problem in the war in Iraq too.
What was the case when it was being reported? It's very difficult to know when, you're getting the Hamas version of a story and then you're getting the Israeli version of a story. What happened when there was the aid truck and people started getting shot?
The one last night?
No, it was a while ago.
Oh, okay. So yes,
that one.
That was a couple weeks ago. That I don't have the full detailed version up to date of what happened there, but I believe it had something to do with a clash between the IDF and other Palestinians that were involved in distributing the aid. Because what you have is you have Hamas, but you also have powerful families in Gaza that you could call them sort of criminal syndicates or whatever, but they're powerful, important families as well that are also taking the aid sometime. And these are the families that if Israel is allowed and goes into Rafah and defeats Hamas, one of the possibilities is that they want to get these powerful Palestinian families to take over the Gaza Strip, and these people are also involved in the distribution of aid, or in the hoarding of aid, or in the stealing of aid, or in the taking of aid and then selling it for very high prices on the secondary market, which is why it may not be getting to everyone in the north.
So are those the people that the Israeli soldiers shot?
No, I think
All right, we're going to pause right there. So there's really some big ideas from both sides of the issue. So you have the people that are really trying to wrestle with how is this happening, this humanitarian crisis in Gaza. These people, these civilians are suffering. Innocent women and children. They're being killed. They are suffering through these massive bombings. Their homes are being crushed. They're facing malnutrition, starvation, and a lot of suffering. That's the first thing. They're dying. There's a lot of pain and suffering. Second, there's a lot of aid that's not getting to the civilians that are in Gaza. Coleman Hughes comes back and he says this major point that we just highlighted before. It says Hamas on purpose, terrorists on purpose, embed themselves with the civilian population so that those that are trying to get rid of Hamas can't do their job without harming the civilian population, because the terrorists have done such a good job of enmeshing themselves within the civilian population. And when they're trying to get aid to those civilians, to the women and children who aren't fighting, the people who are embedding themselves, the terrorists that are embedding themselves with that civilian population, are not letting the aid get to those people, further increasing the suffering that these civilians are experiencing in Gaza. And it's not the fault of the Israelis, it's not the fault of the IDF, and it's not the fault of people trying to get the aid in to the civilians in Gaza. Coleman Hughes is arguing it's the fault of Hamas and the terrorists that aren't letting the aid get to those civilians in Gaza. They're not letting any aid, and they're taking it from the civilians. So even if the Israelis want to give the aid to the civilians, Hamas is getting in the way of it.
I think it turned into it could have been a panic firefight, and they killed civilians.
What caused the panic firefight?
I don't think there's details. That I don't know.
So the
That one I don't know.
accusation was that they were shooting people that were trying to
Yes.
get aid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you don't think that's the case?
I think it's very unlikely.
Is it possible?
Yeah, it's possible. Absolutely. My assumption is that there is going to be war crimes in this war.
Right.
Because, and I know Kurt would probably say I'm doing the tragedy of war thing, but it's actually a legitimate point. In every single war, even the just ones, there are war crimes by berserk soldiers, by the good guys.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's genocide, and that doesn't mean it's not a just war.
That is a very important point, the war crimes thing, because I think when you're asking someone to follow and obey rules, when you're also asking them to murder people that they don't even know, and that these are the bad people, like, you have it in your head that those are the people that you have to kill, and you're getting shot at, and you're watching your friends die, and you're 2 years into this now, whatever it is. When you're in Ukraine, for instance,
Mhm.
you're 2 years into it, getting shot at, and like, I'm sure they do some horrific shit if they catch people, or if they get someone that they think is on the other side, or someone who looks like they're on the other side. It's you're asking a person to do an insanely evil and horrific thing, but then stop when the rules don't apply. And some people are not going to do that.
That's right. And I think that the fundamental difference between Israel and Hamas is Israeli society, however imperfectly, is not going to celebrate the monsters on their own side when they're really found to be monsters. They're not gonna hand out candies to people who kill Palestinian civilians like Hamas does, in reverse. And so my feeling about it is still that, any nation that suffered what Israel did on October 7th, everyone in the country would be saying, you have to go get these guys. You have to eliminate this organization that did this. And if they're 80% finished with that job, it would make no sense at this point to stop before you've cut out the last 20% of the cancer, or before you've put out the last 20% of the fire, right? Even with all of the absolute suffering that is real on the Palestinian side. So that's how I feel about it. And I think it's very, very distinct from genocide, because genocide is when you're trying to maximize civilian casualties. I think Israel, however imperfectly, is doing the opposite. They're trying to minimize civilian casualties.
That's interesting.
Really interesting point, like Joe Rogan is about to say. That is the big difference between a genocide and war. When you're practicing genocide, you're trying to maximize the civilian population. You're just trying to maximize the casualties of the civilian population. You're trying to wipe them out. That is not the goal of the IDF and the Israelis. The goal of the IDF and the Israelis is to remove that cancer of Hamas, to remove the threat of those terrorists that committed those atrocities on October 7th, and to make it so it couldn't happen again. They're not trying to kill civilians. That is not their primary purpose, and that is not their goal, and that's not what they're trying to do. It's just unfortunate and very difficult to do that when the enemy, military organization has embedded and enmeshed itself with the civilian population to make it almost not even separable, to make it indistinct between the enemy's combatants and the civilians. Let's get back to it.
Interesting. What would people say that would disagree with you when they talk about targeting mosques, targeting hospitals? And we know that some of the targeting hospital stories are just not true. Like the New York Times printed a story saying that the hospital was bombed and that X amount of people died. But it turns out the bomb actually hit the parking lot of the hospital.
Right.
And a very small amount
We
of people
talked about
died.
that last time.
Yeah. So there is some but there have been for sure targeting of mosques, like for instance. Do you think that's because Hamas uses these mosques?
Absolutely.
So when
Absolutely.
they're
There's been
blowing up their infrastructure and bombing the mosques and bombing whatever it is, schools, they're doing it because Hamas is in those schools.
they're doing
Really big point. You hear two big points here. One, Joe Rogan saying, do you think that they're bombing these mosques, schools, and hospitals because Hamas is there? And that's where they are. They're embedding themselves in the most focal points, the most, what you would say are the most peaceful and most those places where there should be shelters and not be attacked, not be able to be attacked, because that's where you would not launch attacks from if you were not a terrorist organization, if you're acting in good faith. However, Hamas is not doing that. They use these schools, hospitals, and mosques as places to launch their attacks from. Second, Joe has also said, okay, what's going on here with these different media organizations that they get reports from Israel, they get reports from Hamas, they get reports from Gaza, what's going on in these attacks that are happening there? And people in Hamas or different people in Gaza will say that the Israelis had bombed a certain place, like this hospital back earlier in the conflict, that Israel had decimated a hospital, when really they hit a parking lot. And this is one of the first casualties of war, is the truth, what actually happens. And that's something we have to work through. And there's a whole propaganda part to this whole war. And what's the information coming from one side and what's the information coming from another? And so much can happen in the fog of war where you can't know what is the truth. And you have respected media organizations. When I say respected, quote unquote, respected and quote unquote credible and trustworthy news organizations like the New York Times, that'll take this and run with it. And the consequences of it are severe. You can remember what happened right after that story, there was a flood of protests that happened all over New York, claiming that Israel was committing war crimes and it was such a terrible thing because they had just blown up a hospital, when in fact it wasn't true.
It because they have good faith intelligence that Hamas is in those schools.
And they tell them that these people are using human shields, and they say, well, the most important thing is getting rid of Hamas.
Yeah, the laws of war say you cannot target a church, a mosque, a hospital, but if the enemy turns that hospital into a military operation site, as Hamas does, which is it's routine for them, then it can become legitimate. Then you have to do a proportionality assessment. Is it worth killing this many civilians to get the bad guys? And that's a judgment call that I think reasonable people can disagree on a case by case basis. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I would disagree with that I would agree with every bombing that Israel has made. I might think I'm certain there's one that was not worth it. You killed too many people for.
Yeah.
But that's a judgment call that armies are allowed to make in times of war. And Hamas is the one that turns these civilian locations into military operation sites.
Yeah.
Which is a war.
Such a big point. And he's about to say it's a war crime. The laws of war said you can't attack a school, a church, mosque, synagogue, a hospital, place of worship. But then the enemy embeds itself in those exact places. That's the war crime.
War crime. It's impossible. This is the way I would put it succinctly. If you ask the question, what is unique about this war? What is different about this war than all other wars? It's not the civilian death toll. The ratio of combatants to civilians is, I think it's better than the American armies was when we got ISIS out of Mosul. That was like 10,000 civilians dead to kill 4,000 ISIS. This is 19,000 civilians dead to kill 13,000. It's not. It's not that. The what's unique about this war, unlike every other war that I could think of, is you have an army in Hamas that has perfected the art of embedding itself and meshing itself with civilians so that you cannot hit them without hitting the people around them. Other armies have done this, but none have perfected it to the extent that Hamas has. No army that I know of in military history has had 15 years to build 300 miles of tunnel underneath a city that they don't use to shelter the civilians, but they use to shelter themselves so that they can operate right under a kindergarten, right under a mosque. So this is a challenge no army has faced. And so that's what makes this war different. And yes, I agree with all of the absolute tragedy and suffering of the Palestinian people, but it's what creates that is the way Hamas fights. And either we can say one of two things. We can either say, well, Israel doesn't have a clean shot, and so they have to let Hamas get away with it because it's too much to bear. But then we are essentially creating a situation where terrorists have found the perfect solution, which is that you can cross the border, go house to house slaughtering your enemies, and then hide behind your own people and they can do nothing about it. It's a perfect strategy. Can we live in a world where we allow that to be an acceptable strategy? I don't think so. And it's very ugly to watch. It's heartbreaking, and I completely understand why people don't think the way I think when they see the videos. I completely get it. But I don't think we can actually live in a world where that's allowed to be a strategy.
I appreciate your perspective.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
So that might be the most important part of this whole interview, or at least it was that clip that I saw floating around different social media channels that compelled me to watch the podcast, so this interview, and to even do a reaction video on it. That was, such a brilliant take. Something that you don't hear at all much discussed in the mainstream media. You don't hear it that much talked on internet, on YouTube, different social media channels. The question, what is unique about this war? What is unique about this war? And what Coleman Hughes is suggesting is unique about this war is that these terrorists have had 15 years to create all these tunnels, 300 miles of tunnels underneath the land of Gaza, and to embed themselves within the most important civilian locations in Gaza to launch their war and to embed themselves within the civilian population. And like he was saying, they went from house, don't forget, you can't forget what took place on October 7th. They went from house to house, slaughtering all these different women and children, all these civilians, and the atrocities that happened there, and just killing people when they were out at a festival, having killed children, put them in ovens, kidnapping people. I mean, it was abhorrent what happened on that day. The atrocities were despicable and disgraceful. And now they are hiding behind civilians and making that part of the essential part of how they're continuing with this conflict. And he also highlights the most difficult part in dealing with this whole thing. So because the you have two options, either saying, okay, we're going to um, go out and try to eradicate the organization that committed these atrocities, or because it's too difficult to go after these people because you can't get rid of them without having massive civilian casualties, we're just going to let it slide. And if you just let it slide, you say that you can't do anything about it and you won't retaliate for it, you're telling the world and other aligned organizations that are aligned with Hamas, other terrorist organizations, that they found the perfect solution to accomplishing what it is that they want to do, and it's commit more terrorism. It's attack your enemies, attack the civilian population of your enemy, and then hide behind your own civilians afterwards. And then they can do nothing about it. And that's not something that we can allow to stand. Now, another important thing is he said, what's unique about this war? Now, I don't know if it's unique about this war because you have heard something similar to this from a lot of American soldiers who had to fight the war on terror in the past 20 years that America was involved in it. And they said that something that they experienced so often was that when they would have to go out and fight the enemy, many times they would have to confront the enemy that was hiding behind those who were using human shields, using women and children as their shields to protect themselves or to make it more difficult for the American soldiers to fight. So I don't know how unique it is about it. In fact, I would say it seems to be a common tactic that the terrorists and Islamic jihadists and people and organizations like Hamas use when they're fighting the war. I think an important one to think about is when America was in the war in Iraq and the operation in Fallujah, and they had to go house to house. It was the most probably similar situation to what is happening in Gaza right now. And the Americans had to go house to house in Fallujah, and it's considered one of the most difficult things is urban combat and going door to door to try to secure the area. And you would not know what's behind every door, and just the mental issues, the difficulties that you have to work through as a soldier, trying to not kill civilians, but not knowing what's behind the door. If either it's going to be an innocent person or an enemy that's hiding behind an innocent person and that's trying to kill you. This is one of the most difficult and delicate situations about this conflict.
Yeah. You clearly know more about it than I do, but also pretty crazy to be right next door to people that hate you and not have guns.
Yeah, that I don't know. Maybe they are armed, but these are people who are like, they're living in communes.
But what did they think the response was going to be? I mean, the response, they had to think that Israel would do something comparable to what they're doing, or the possibility of them doing something comparable to what they're doing was always there. That they would just go all out.
Yes, but I think that from Hamas's point of view, Hamas could never hold a candle to the IDF. We all know that. There's a huge power imbalance. They have no chance of beating the IDF militarily. So you have to ask, what is their goal? Well, their goal is that in the long run, the world will turn against Israel so deeply and sympathize with their cause so much that Hezbollah, Iran, and all kinds of forces will get involved on their side, and America, the great Satan, will abandon Israel. And in that case, they have a very good chance of beating Israel. If Hezbollah, Iran team up and America's not there, they're thinking about 50, 100 years. They will free their land from the Jews that they hate. And so, viewed from that perspective, Israel launching a big attack to get rid of them, killing a lot of civilians because they use the human shield method, is a winning strategy potentially. Because look how much sympathy from the PR war they have gotten as a result of this.
Almost instantaneously.
Okay, so they're not fighting a military war. They know they have no chance. They're not idiots. They're fighting a PR war, whereas Israel is fighting a military war. And they're both actually winning at those respective wars that they are fighting.
Interesting. Have you had a debate with anybody about?
Now, that is one of the most important points that was brought up in this whole interview, and one of the most insightful points. What is the type of war that is fighting here? I mean, this is very profound right here, because I think a lot of people, when they're having this conversation and trying to assess what's really going on in the Israel-Hamas conflict, about what's the real nature of this war. And it takes somebody with a lot of insight and intellectual maturity to see through the surface layer of everything that's happening and go underneath and seeing what's really happening in this situation. And what Coleman Hughes is suggesting here is that it's not even really this war, a war of physically getting rid of your enemy or killing your enemy, from the perspective of Hamas. What he's suggesting is their end goal, or is their main purpose and their primary objective in all this, is a propaganda war, a PR war, to get the world, the international community, and to change people's hearts and minds from supporting one side of the conflict, to supporting Israel's side, to supporting their side, and to convincing the world that they are the victims in this whole conflict. Now, I think it's important to remember, there's a lot of different theories about war and the different types of war. I would argue that there's three main types of war. There's economic war, there's information war, and there's kinetic war. And this is exactly, and what we look at this, and then you can kind of go into each one of those three buckets or three verticals and delve into more details about what's a different type, or how something that's a certain type of war falls into one of those categories. And understanding the type of war that you are in is fundamental to understanding the conflict and what's the truth between what one side is trying to do and what's another side trying to do. And Coleman Hughes is really smart here and saying, it's not really something that the Israelis, it's not really something that Hamas is really concerned about when it says just killing Israelis. I mean, that's something that is part of their war, and it's in the kinetic side for sure, absolutely. But what is their primary purpose is the PR war, is the information war, and changing people's opinions, and especially the opinions of institutions, of sovereignties, of nation states, from supporting one side to supporting the Israel side to supporting their side. When we look at what's going on with Israel, now that's a whole different thing. They're fighting a war of kinetic war. That's what their main focus is and their primary objective, or what they're putting all their attention and focus on. And they're doing that and from their perspective of retaliating and getting rid of that cancer of the enemy terrorist organization that committed these atrocities on October 7th. They're doing a pretty decent job of that, of accomplishing that goal. But it seems like they're forgetting what was the main mission of Hamas during all of this, from the perspective of Coleman Hughes, who's suggesting that what they're really focused on is the information war. and trying to tell people who's right, trying to say who is the right side in this fight between Israel and Hamas. And you can tell by all the protests that happen, by a lot of the different opinions that you hear voiced on social media, by a lot of these movements that are happening across the world, the pro-Palestinian movement that you see being taking place throughout Europe and throughout the U.S., that Hamas is winning that part of the war, and they're doing a good job of waging it. So that's a perspective from Coleman Hughes, who I think is a really smart intellectual here. And when we're trying to think about, okay, is Israel, one, committing genocide here? What's the real nature about this war? What is the true nature about this war? And what is different about this war? Really recommend you check out this interview and this podcast. There's a lot that was said here by both Joe Rogan and Coleman Hughes, trying to work through this whole Israel-Hamas conflict that is really having a big impact on the different, on our society and our culture. And I invite you to watch it. And I hope this video helped you kind of work out what is the truth about this war. See you in the next video.